の桜帰りの色花は吉野に嵐吹く大和王の子と生まれては三平線の花と地へ借用の筒は武器ならず水上の剣なりません知らずやここに2000年北へ北へし大和玉運気を回る者の句はすべてその数20万84箇所にたむろして武装は国家人夢にだも千里東西波越えて我にあらばす国あらば港以前輸送船しばしばこれや海の人敵地に一歩我踏めば軍の主兵がここにあり最後の決は我が任務聞いていい法兵力らせよ
Ideologies and political systems. Okay. This is where it gets really complicated because every colony has their own system, or sometimes every cluster of colonies. It depends on how big each colony is, you know, and if they've like put colonies all over a planet or if it's just one per planet in a certain quadrant. That's kind of complicated, but there are a lot of different systems. Most of them are essentially fascist, obsessed with the military, obsessed with historic imagery, and obsessed with purity, not necessarily purity of race, but purity of species, definitely. Hybrids are not tolerated in most of these places. The degree to which that is visible can vary a lot. In places like Vega Prime, it was virtually an apartheid state, where like there were extremely strict laws against humans and aliens mixing. You know, they could not go to the same hospitals, they could not go to the same hotels, they could not use the same public bathrooms, any of that stuff. So heavy segregation. In New Atlantis, on the other hand, there are very, very few divides, or at least visible divides, and people just kind of mix around how they please, and it's pretty much a non-issue. But there are others where there's a democracy in place, and you do vote for your leaders, although those leaders are still completely and utterly subservient to the military. So it's still always essentially a military dictatorship, for all intents and purposes. You rarely ever find a place where, like, the military is questioned openly. I'm sure that the youth and, like, the subcultures do, that I know that they do, but it's not, even by a lot of people who are kind of outcast from society, it's still not really tolerated. It's a fringe opinion to question the military in any way. So that's how that works. I've often described it as being kind of like the Roman Empire, but that's not, I've since realized that's not entirely accurate. The Roman Empire left locals in charge for the most part. These people are not locals, they're colonists, but I guess they are local colonists. I hope that makes sense.
What is the Germans' main cultural mythos that they base their superiority upon? How far back in history do they trace their roots?
They go back to pre-Atlantean times. They go back to the first humans. They claim that they are the closest, both genetically and culturally, to the first humans on Earth. They claim that like Norse culture and Atlantean culture are very similar. And they also talk about the quote-unquote gods, the Anunnaki, and they point out that they look the most like the Anunnaki of any ethnic group. So that means they're the closest to the quote-unquote gods. That's basically how that goes.
Do they claim to have created a new anthropotype, i.e. some kind of a better space human? How do they explain the need for such strict apartheid with the ETs?
I don't think they put it that way, but kind of, yes. They do claim to be, that their genetics are better, which is probably true given the sheer amount of eugenics they have engaged in. They probably do have like somewhat better genetics, most of them, than we do, but you know, they didn't get there organically or ethically. How do they explain the need for such strict apartheid with ETs? The term they would probably use is biological hygiene, or genetic hygiene, which is, I think, pretty self-explanatory.
What happened to Hitler, to your knowledge? What do the Germans in space say about him? Do they have Führer-type rulers today?
There are conflicting ideas. Some of them in space say that he wound up on Titan, and that he's still living there today, but he has no actual power or anything. Some say that he died old and bitter in Argentina. Personally, I lean towards the he died old and bitter in Argentina. But on the other hand, I do believe his children are in space. What they say about him for the most part is that he was like a syphilis-addled idiot. That's pretty much what they say. Do they have Führer-type rulers today? Yes. A lot of planets do. Not all of them, but some of them do. For example, Titan has the one and only Klaus Barbie running it as a Führer-type ruler. And there are other planets. I'm bad with names, to be honest with you, of both the planets and particularly the people running them. But I know that they do have those.
You said that Aldebaran pushed the Germans to exterminate the Jews. Why were they targeted? Were the Slavs and the Gypsies also chosen to be exterminated for a specific reason?
Yes, Aldebaran was behind that. It had to do with like DNA supremacy and like the fact that there were a lot of Jews in Europe intermixing sometimes, even though not even that much, but sometimes with Aryan Europeans who Aldebaranites consider their... And the Jews also have the blood of one of the ETs that, at least the Ashkenazi Jews have the blood of one of the aliens that Aldebaran is or historically was at war with, so that adds to it. The Slavs, I believe, was also spurred on by Aldebaran. I don't know quite what their issue is with Slavs. I'm less read in on that side of the history. And the Gypsies, who knows? To be honest, I think that the Gypsies were an organic genocide. It was really horrific, but at that time, many people in Europe had genocidal ideas about that ethnic group. Many people did, and many still do, but back then it was particularly horrific. So that may have just happened naturally. We're killing all these other people, may as well kill all these people we don't like already. I don't know.
Which of the World War II Nazi leaders went off-world and continued to rule there? Who were the main figures that made the deals with the Draco and organized the German exodus into space?
Lots of them. Most of them were not the ones you would have heard of. Most of them were commandants of both ships and battalions and also of camps. I'm struggling with names right now. Karl Immermann, who was a noted and decorated Kriegsmarine captain, was one of them. As well as Klaus Barbie, the infamous Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, who was and still is ruling Titan with an iron fist, and he did not get any better or any different. His politics did not change, his ways of expressing his politics did not change, none of that changed. And also the infamous Alois Brunner, he was part of it as well. He's quite high up in Centurion politics. The biggest one leading that charge was Goebbels, who was splitting off from Hitler because of, well, for obvious reasons, I would imagine. Goebbels was the one who was actually in charge. Hitler was a figurehead. Goebbels was the one actually calling the shots for the most part. And particularly later into the war, when things were going really off the rails, Goebbels was the one who took the reins, at least behind the scenes, and was getting shit done and providing an outlet, because the loss of the war was incredibly obvious at that point.
How is the German central government generally organized? Is there a party-type system that is overseeing all affairs?
No, there is not a party structure at all. There are no elections. There is no like real opposition. I mean, there are uprisings from time to time, but no, there is no party system. It is a military dictatorship in the purest sense. and regular life is very depoliticized. Like, you know, people don't really talk about or think about politics for the most part. They just kind of are living their lives. The only political thing that happens is when everyone gets conscripted and then they come home. And they might talk about their service if they've been allowed to remember it, which many people are not. And it's just an accepted fact that when people come home from their service, they won't remember it. It's not a very political system like how we would think of it. It is a military dictatorship, pure and simple.
How many worlds do you remember being in Das Bundes? What are their main power centers?
It's more correctly Der Bund. Das Bundes, at least according to a couple of Germans I asked about it, is not grammatically correct. It's Der Bund. But to answer the question, there are about 10,000 worlds in it, with about 9.6 trillion citizens. And what are their main power centers? They have a number of main power centers, but their two biggest ones are Mars for military power, and for financial power their main center is Centurion. Vega Prime also used to be a very major power center financially, however it is, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but it is no longer occupied by the Germans. It is now under Aldebaranite occupation, which is an entire story unto itself that is beyond the scope of this particular show. They also have other power centers. There is a lot of, what little of actual politics there is, a lot of it emanates from Titan. Yeah.
How do they ensure a singular ideology and loyalty to the central government across so many colonies?
It's simple because, as I stated, there's not really politics. There's only the military. That's the only thing uniting them. That's the only structure that people know is the military, and whatever the military says goes, and you do not question it under any circumstances. And people who do it are disappeared or worse, and so people just kind of don't question it, and they just live their lives pretty normally. I guess, it's kind of like during the White Terror in Taiwan, I guess you might say. So, martial law. And loyalty is a complicated thing. People are required to be conscripted, and there's not really a way out of it because everyone has chips at birth, so they don't get to say no or disappear. I mean, some people manage to disappear by going way outside the territory, but needless to say, that's not accessible or, you know, plausible for most people. So it's a thing where people just passively obey. They're all pretty happy otherwise, you know, for the most part. I mean, slaves are not happy, but the majority of the population in colonies are not slaves. They're just middle-class people who are just kind of living their lives, and their lives are way better than ours. So I guess it's kind of like an Aldous Huxley whole new Brave New World situation.
Do they have a stated goal for the Federation that everybody is supposed to work towards?
Preservation of the human species, or well, the Solarian species, I guess. Even though there are trillions of them already, and there is absolutely zero danger of extinction, there's still this propaganda push that, like, we could all die off at any moment. So, you know, serve the military to fight our enemies and come home and make babies, make as many babies as you can for the machine. And people are generally fine with that, so it's just one of those things where people don't question it. In case this isn't already clear, this place is not the utopian, you know, fully automated luxury space communist place that certain people portray it as. It is a dystopia, but it's a very pleasant dystopia, but it is still a dystopia.
Do they harbor ambitions to take over Terra, or do they have enough real estate and resources not to bother with it?
Complicated. I think a lot of people, if they knew that Terra was still here and that it's still inhabited, they probably would like to take over it. Although the higher-ups, and the higher-ups do know it, they don't wish to, including Heinrich, my alter, who is, I mean, he's not insanely high up, but he's pretty high up. He's one of their best diplomats and communicators, and he definitely knows what's up, let's put it that way. He would not want to take over this planet. they view it as extremely backwards, and they say that this planet is run by a bunch of, like, gay Jews. I'm saying what they say. I'm not saying that I agree with that. I do not agree with that at all. And I do not promote that line of thinking, but that is kind of how they would put it. And yeah, they have enough real estate, and they're constantly getting new real estate. That has changed somewhat recently, with a number of their outermost colonies being, and with Vega Prime also being taken over. But that's what happens. So they have had to find places to resettle, but like Terra has never been a serious place for consideration as to where they might settle.
Are there efforts among the colonies to gain more autonomy or secede completely? Have there been any successful cases?
Very, very rarely, but yes, it has happened. They have a fair amount of autonomy already. You know, for the most part, they can make their own laws. The only real requirement is that they have mandatory conscription, and that they not adopt certain ideologies, such as they're not allowed to adopt like full communism. They can be socialist but not fully communist. And yes, people, there is a difference between those two things. That's for my audience, not for yours. I'm sure your audience knows that pretty well, but like, and they're not allowed to adopt like anarchism or like fully free market like libertarian capitalism. That's not allowed either. But for the most part, they can do what they like. They just choose to follow a template because it mostly works. And there have been one or two successful cases. There was one successful case in probably the late 80s, early 90s of a colony that in a star near Ursa Minor. It's not, you can't see it with the naked eye, but the nearest star you could see with the naked eye from Earth would have been Ursa Minor, that seceded, and it wasn't, they got away with that because it wasn't that important. It was pretty much just a city. They were net importers. They did not produce much. If I remember correctly, I think it was on a planet that was not, it was not a habitable planet. It was a habitat on an uninhabitable planet. So they were, you know, net importers, which means they're still paying a lot of money to Das Bundes in order to get the goods that they need. And they didn't have that many people, so Das Bundes thought, okay, we'll just let them go just let them go, because they're still completely dependent on us anyway. So that's the only way they would ever willingly allow a place to secede, is if it was going to still be completely dependent on them and still basically a de facto colony. A revolution on a colony would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, at least for it to succeed. There have been a few attempts, here and there, but they have not succeeded. So as a general rule, people just kind of, again, they just kind of accept it all and don't pay too much attention.
Overall, would you say that the German political system is working or failing in meeting their own goals? Are they generally a stable interstellar society?
I would say yes, they're working on achieving their own goals, such as they even are at this point. You know, they're so old and they've expanded so much that the only real goal left is continuing to expand and diversify, I guess. So yeah, I'd say they're succeeding at that. And are they a stable interstellar society? For the most part, yes. I would say that it's actually a very fragile stability. You know, if they were to take a major attack by any galactic empire, then it would, I think, immediately crumble and become just a fractured non-state, and people would, you know, every planet for themselves, and probably eventually every ship for themselves. But that hasn't happened yet, so for now I would say they are quite stable, yes.
Do the Germans still use the swastika as their main symbol? And what is their flag? What other symbols are used?
The swastika is not their main symbol anymore, no. It's still relatively common, but it's still not their main symbol by any stretch. What is their flag? This is in dispute, actually, as to what the main flag should be. You'll find a lot of different flags used. It's kind of just, you can use most of them and people will not be too offended, although some people of course will be. But the main one that I remember the most a white German eagle on a blue background holding in its claws the galaxy. I have a picture of it actually. I had someone make it for me a while back, so I can send that. What other symbols are used? I think kind of the closest thing they have to the main national symbol would be the Sonnenrad. You'll see that on ships' hulls a lot, and on quite a number of planetary flags, and people wear it on badges and stuff to show like national pride and whatever. So that's kind of their main symbol, more or less. You know, with 10,000 planets, it's hard to make a general statement.
What is the name of the Japanese breakaway? How did it form? Were they brought to space by the Germans or received their own offer to go from some ET groups?
I don't know the official name of their breakaway, if there even is one. I know that they call themselves, the name that you'll hear in conversation and all of that is Sen no Taiyo no Tekkoku, the Empire of 1,000 Suns. And their military is known as Yozora no Kunshu, or Monarchs of the Night Sky. They were formed by, in the same way as the Germans were, these two questions kind of go hand in hand. They were formed because they came as a package deal, essentially. The Germans could not have survived in space without them because they were the only people who were making clones on an industrial scale at that time, and the Germans could not have done without that. So they signed on as a package deal. All of those negotiations that people talk about where there were Germans present, both where they were with the aliens at the end of the war, and also the ones in the 50s with the American government. There were Japanese present at those two. There is no separating the two. At least there was not back then.
What are some of the interesting traits of the Japanese ideology and system? Are they still imperial, i.e. serving a monarch?
They don't serve a monarch, they serve their military. You know, the generals are basically like gods in their system. Their ideology is not really terribly different from the Germans, to be honest. It's like Solarian supremacy and militarism in the extreme, and keeping the population separated from anything political so that they don't notice the fucked up shit that's going on. Their system, I will say, I consider their system a bit worse than the Germans because they have more of a transhumanism thing going on. Japanese colonies, I'd say, are more cyberpunk than German ones. German ones, I would say, are biopunk, where there's like, you know, biotechnology-based society. But Japanese breakaway society, Sen no Taiyo no Tekkoku society, is ruled by cybernetics, and the biggest cybernetics monopoly in this, by far and away, is Arasaka Robotics. There will be much said about them in the coming volumes of my book. I am one of the first people to, if not the first person to fully expose what they're doing and everything, but essentially they're the biggest power in the Japanese breakaway monetarily. You know, they easily buy up planets and they buy up politicians and military people within the breakaway like it's no issue, and so forth.
How do the Germans and the Japanese states share their dominion? For example, how was the Vega Prime colony organized? Have there been any contention between the two nations over territory, ideology, etc.?
How do they share their dominion? It depends. In a lot of cases they kind of don't. There's enough space and they have enough oomph, for lack of a better term, enough military prowess, I should say, that they can always just go and get some more real estate, usually. So there's not usually that much overlap, but when there is, it's usually kind of like a China and Hong Kong situation, where it's like one country, two systems, where they're both like, it's always either officially either a Der Bundfreier Deutschen Welten planet or a Sen no Taiyo no Tekkoku planet, but they divide themselves enough that it's where like the two communities can officiate their own laws and everything. The Vega Prime colony was a pretty unique example, to an extent in that it's one of the flagship planets, and it was back when there was still a colony there, and there was also, they were integrated, the German and Japanese communities were integrated to a large degree. They spoke each other's languages, they would eat each other's food, they went to the same schools, they learned the same subjects at school. Intermarriages were common and accepted, but that's a rare thing in these kind of colonies where there even is overlap, which is, again, not all that common. Has there been any contention between the two nations over territory, ideology, etc.? Not too much, because again, they can just go out and grab new territory for the most part. There have been, I believe, a few diplomatic disputes that I've had to sort out. The memories are kind of spotty of that, but there have been a few diplomatic disputes, but it has never, that I am aware of, come to military engagement. In general, they get along extremely well.
What are the general specialties of the Japanese in space that no other group has?
Cybernetics is the big one. You'll often hear Penny talk about these cyborg factories where they take the dead and the dying soldiers and, you know, unwanted people, prisoners, refugees, whatever, and convert them into cyborgs or synthetics. That is a Japanese industry through and through, and it's in a big way the backbone of the Breakaway, because those cyborgs that are created are a big chunk, a huge chunk of the labor force. Those roads that are everywhere in the Breakaway, you know, like in any city, there would be no roads without them. There would be no cities at all without them. There would be no ships built without them. Nothing. So that's the big contribution, and they do other cybernetics as well. It's very common for people to have cybernetic implants in the Breakaway, and most of those are of Japanese origin. And a lot of the technology is, not all of it. For example, the glass pads are not Japanese made, the glass pads are German made, but a lot of other technologies are. So cybernetics is their big thing that makes them indisposable, completely indisposable to the Breakaway.
What were the general conditions that the bigger Breakaway groups proposed to the smaller Terran nations to join them in space? In other words, what did the latter ones have to give, and what did they get in exchange?
Almost uniformly, what they wanted was people. More people to both to stock their colonies and for military applications. And nearly always these were children to be turned over, and these children were of certain ethnic groups. The Breakaway groups were always very specific with who they wanted. They did not want just anyone. They wanted specific ethnic groups who were known to be psychic, who were known to have high proportions of what Penny has referred to as metagene, psychic DNA. And these were not just Germanic kids. These were all different ethnic groups of kids, such as, you know, the many indigenous tribes of the Americas and the Caribbean, Native Hawaiians, some Pacific Islanders. They really like Sephardic Jews. They really like some African tribes that I don't really know the name of off the top of my head, but certain West African tribes from the Congo. Not Congolese people. They want the minority tribes, people from the Congo, as well as certain East and Southeast Asian groups, such as the Hmong people, known in China as the Miao people. They like Tibetans. They really like Aboriginal Australians. They really like Finns. They really like Ainu people. They really like those, and so forth. And the other stipulation was always absolute secrecy. You will not tell anyone that you have approached us. You will never disclose that you have made this deal, because our existence is not to be questioned, I guess. because people would question it. I'm sure if they found out, oh wait, these people are like, making deals for our children behind our backs and we don't have any say in it, people would definitely question that. And what these nations get in exchange is technology and knowledge and the capability to make their own SSP, which they nearly always take upon themselves because Earth is, in a large way, I don't know how else to put it, Earth is fucked. I'm not saying there's no hope, but to a large degree, Earth is fucked. And they want a way out for themselves and for their elites. These nations do. So they take these deals. They think that, like, selling a few 100,000 kids a year, especially if they're of minority groups who they don't like anyway, to them that's worth it. So that's how those deals have gone down historically. And whenever a new nation pops up, nations have come and gone since then. South Sudan was created just a few years ago, for example. Montenegro was created less than 20 years ago. Yugoslavia fell in the 90s, and so on. And so whenever those new nations are created, or whenever someone absorbs another one, they just go in and make a new deal. So, these deals are not stagnated in the sense that they don't happen anymore. They are still happening whenever a new country pops up.
Do many of the colonies of the current Earth nations also de facto become breakaway, or do they stay integrated with their nations of origin? How are some of their governments organized?
Usually they become de facto breakaway unless their country back home is an economic powerhouse, like a real economic powerhouse. A prime example of this would be when the Soviet Union SSP colonies all became independent, sort of, after, the fall of the Soviet Union. When that happened, most of those places became breakaway colonies, except for Russian colonies, because in the former Soviet Union, Russia is the only real economic powerhouse. So like Ukrainian colonies, Lithuanian colonies, Polish colonies, you name it, they all became either German-owned or corporate-owned at that point. So, you won't find like an independent Lithuanian colony that still has ties to Lithuania on Earth. That's not a thing, because Lithuania just does not have the financial and military capability to support a network of colonies in space. But some that are connected to economic powerhouses do maintain ties, at least to a degree, with their home nations, such as, British colonies, or Canadian colonies, or most European countries that have colonies. Those maintain at least their military ties with their home countries. They still use the same names for their military branches, they still follow the same regulations, all that good stuff. And they usually will keep the same laws in place, except of course there are a lot of times different laws are applicable to a degree when you're on a foreign planet, but they'll keep most of the same laws regardless, and then add on to it whatever they have to. But, if it's not an economic powerhouse, then they become de facto owned by one of the major breakaway groups. Like I mentioned, a lot of former Soviet nations, Southeast Asia is not particularly an economic powerhouse or a military powerhouse, so they're de facto breakaway owned, and so on.
If those were Soviet colonies, then logically there would be a mixture of people from around the USSR and them under one flag. Did you really see some ethnically specific colonies representing different Soviet republics?
I would say that they typically, they kept them ethnically slanted, much like the countries of the Soviet Union, where, like, Lithuania was still majority Lithuanian, and Lithuanian was still the main language. However, yeah, there was plenty of diversity still. That's the reason why after the fall of the Soviet Union, most of those colonies wound up becoming corporate, was because there wasn't usually a single ethnic group living there, and so it was difficult to give it back to the home country, and also because those home countries, lost all their money pretty much, and weren't able to support a space program anymore, but yeah.
And lastly, we heard from other insiders that the German commanding officers are all addicted to methamphetamines. And is that a weakness that the Earth Alliance can use to beat them for good and make the space great again, so to speak?
No, they're not all addicted to meth. I'm sorry to these people who have these little fantasies that have been fed to them by their commanding officers, and that whom they trust, because I guess that's just where their intelligence level is at, naming no names, of course. No, they're not all addicted to meth, sad to say.